Thanks everyone for kind of attending this the March 2025 Fireside webinar. Um, Today, as many of you know, we're going to focus really on kind of real estate transactions and defensible space and how that this point in time when a lot of work is being done on the property, there's an event and how it can be used to effectively increase defensible space compliance and participation in the community. So first, I'd just go ahead and like to make introductions. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Jason Brooks, kind of the CEO and co-founder of FireAside, and I'm joined with Maria. Want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Maria Marsh. I'm the wildfire prevention specialist with Truckee Fire Protection District.
Thanks, Maria. And so for those of you who don't know, and we'll get into it in just a little bit, Truckee Fire has had a long history, long before even like the state regulation in California came into effect of conducting defensible space inspections related to the real estate transaction. So today we're going to kind of unpack that some and talk about lessons learned, as well as kind of where some of the program is going and some of the impact. Um, First, just as a background for everyone, hopefully most of you know this, but FireAside as a technology platform, we really focus on supporting our hundreds plus now fire departments, fire safe councils throughout the Western United States and Tennessee, providing technology and solutions to really help that reaching of defensible space and home hardening across the community level. And the reason we're really interested and focused in on that real estate transaction is we keep coming back to this theme that so many of us in the space know we have to reach 70%. It's just been proven time and time again. You need 70% of homes to must have defensible space and home hardening to really get that community benefit. And the real estate transaction is this great opportunity, right? Where just the home is transacting, a lot of money is changing hands. There's a lot of motivated parties on both sides, and it just provides this another part of the building blocks to reach that 70%. And so today, again, we're really going to kind of focus in and try talk about how to leverage the real estate transaction in there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maria to sort of like kind of take us through a little bit of kind of overview of the Truckee Fire program.
Great. Thanks, Jason, and thanks for having us today. Just a quick introduction to our district. The Truckee Fire Protection District, we're a special district. So our fire chief reports to a board of directors that is independent from any town council or county official. And that's relevant, I'm sure, for all of you when you're thinking about making ordinances in your own areas. If we jump to the next slide, just a couple of stats on our district. We incorporate a couple of different areas within our jurisdiction. We have one incorporated town, the town of Truckee, that's fully encompassed within our jurisdiction. And we include parts of two unincorporated counties. So we have a lot of different parties involved in actual enforcement and jurisdiction within our boundaries. We have about 16,000 parcels covering over 125 miles. Next slide, Jason. Our division was established by, and we're currently funded by a special tax called Measure T, which is sort of how we refer to our division to start with. It was passed in 2021, and I'll talk a little bit about the handover if you want to jump to the next slide. The Measure T didn't go into effect until 2022. So the real estate sort of program within our district predates my time with the district. It actually goes back to 2019 is when our own real estate ordinance was passed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that process and the details of our ordinance, but that was implemented at that time under the fire prevention team under the direction of the fire marshal. They were using LE 100s, which is CAL FIRE's inspection one-pager form, and eventually switched to using the app software application provided by CAL FIRE. We don't have much data from those sources, unfortunately. So most of our comparisons are from when we actually started using FireAside and had access to a lot more data. In July of 2021, the state of California put into effect its own real estate defensible space disclosure law, commonly referred to as AB 38, but it's actually under California Civil Code 1102. That went into effect in July of 2021. And in September of 2021, Measure T, that special tax was passed by overwhelming majority of voters in the area, which allowed us to create and implement our wildfire Prevention Division Office. In the summer of 2022, our core programs launched, including our 3-year blanket inspection cycle. We started using FireAside software. And in the summer of 2023, I personally took the lead on the real estate program. In 2024, we first conducted an annual realtor webinar, and that sort of started improved communications with the realtor community. And here we are in spring of 2025, and we're recalibrating some things based on the lessons that we've learned that I'm going to share with you guys today. So our next slide, first I'll talk about why we think it's important to differentiate the real estate inspections. I'll put mandatory versus educational in air quotes, if you can imagine. We have a district-wide blanket inspection program on a 3-year cycle, which is supported by local ordinance and state law that defensible space must be maintained at all times. However, we treat those inspections as educational, as we find that that is the most effective way to engage with our homeowners. People seem to respond better at the time of a real estate transaction to being told that they have to do something. And the idea of mandatory compliance is more palatable for people, apparently, at the time of real estate sale. It also gives an opportunity to set a standard for a neighborhood and for the new buyers. We have a high number of property sales, and over time, setting that standard within a neighborhood, it improves sort of the long-term community resilience and changes the aesthetic of what it looks like to live in a forest setting that we have up here in Truckee. There's an opportunity for a fee for service versus which we would not want to do for our educational inspections. Again, people are paying for every other type of inspection that they have conducted at the time of preparing a home for sale. So they're not too opposed to doing that in the big picture of things in conjunction with their real estate transaction. They're usually motivated sellers. They're less emotionally attached to the landscape changes, to, reducing shrubs and taking out trees. And oftentimes they're paying someone to do it for them. So they're not even directly involved anymore at the time that they're selling the property. In addition, from the buyer side, oftentimes the buyer is going to want to re-landscape anyway. So the idea of this, change in what the landscape of the property looks like is not too big of an impact for them. And then along with some of the other things that I've mentioned, there's seems to be more appetite for, or people more willing to accept the idea of stricter inspections. We have lots of out of area buyers and absentee homeowners that are not necessarily familiar with the area with the high fire risk. So it's an opportunity for us to inspect closer to the actual, full standard of the defensible space code. So a new owner knows what compliance looks like and is sort of more accepting of this is the baseline and this is what you need to maintain it to. That last point is actually what I've found is one of the more effective points of communication with realtors. Moving on to the legal framework, what supports both our general inspections and our real estate inspections. Defensible Space Code in California has been around for a long time under Public Resource Code 4291. The very summary baseline of it is that a person who owns a building or structure shall at all times maintain defensible space of 100 feet from the structure. In 2012, Truckee Fire passed our own ordinance, and it essentially adopted PRC 4291. And an important addition that we have there is that the property owner is responsible for 100 feet defensible space from a structure, whether that structure is located on their property or on a neighboring parcel. So we do technically have law behind our general inspections, though, as I said, we treat those as educational. From the real estate side, as I mentioned in 2019, Truckee Fire passed our own ordinance, and I'll just give a couple of summaries from there before I go into more detail about it. It requires that sellers have a defensible space inspection and that completed inspection be provided to the buyer. So essentially, it mandated disclosure of the current defensible space condition. That 2021 implementation of California Civil Code, which is commonly referred to by the Assembly bill that introduced it, AB 38, but in fact, it's Civil Code 1102, requires a couple of more stringent things. Buyers are required to sign a disclosure regarding home hardening. The seller needs to provide compliance with provide a compliant report that was issued within 6 months preceding the transaction, or it gives the option that the buyer is taking responsibility for earning compliance within 1 year of the transaction. So it actually introduced sort of a workaround, but a heavier standard for complying with the law of providing compliance within 6 months preceding the transaction. If we jump to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the background for our local ordinance. It actually became, they started working on it in 2017 when the Tubbs fire, which was at the time the most destructive wildfire in California history, took place nearly in our backyard. It was very close by to the Truckee area. And as you guys probably all know, when there's smoke in the air, there's more appetite from the public for increased regulations. So our then fire chief saw the opportunity to introduce some regulations to, help prevent fires like that happening. They also recognized that it was a strong real estate market, so there was appetite for some additional requirements in conjunction with real estate. And for many of the reasons that I outlined before, they thought it was a good opportunity to introduce a time of sale requirement. They engaged with the local entities, with our local agencies, with the large local HOAs, and with professional organizations, in particular with our Contractors Association and our local Board of Realtors. And through a lot of negotiation and eventually gaining buy-in from the local realtor organization and from title companies, they passed the ordinance that became our 01 2019. And at that time, the language included no time of sale compliance, which was a large negotiating point with the Board of Realtors. Initially, they had wanted to include time of sale compliance required. So essentially, escrow couldn't proceed unless the property was found to be compliant. They also negotiated out a fee for service, which they had originally wanted to implement. And they required disclosure only, which, thinking from the legal perspective, compliance was already captured in PRC 4291. People are required to maintain at all times defensible space compliance. And therefore, what was in conjunction with real estate, it made sense for it to be the disclosure only. Turns out it actually comes with more teeth for the real estate law to require compliance rather than our defensible space code. The other thing that it allowed was a 3-year, let's call it validity for an inspection report, meaning that if I have an inspection in 2021 and I don't sell my property until 2024, that inspection from 2021 could be used for disclosure purposes. And on reflection, and then with the passage of AB 38, that became sort of a moot point, a non-issue, because the more restrictive requirement of AB 38 of that 6-month window took precedent. We do get that question a lot when realtors are looking for a little bit of a workaround, and we have to explain to them that state code takes precedent. So that's sort of the background on how our ordinance came into effect. And with the passage of AB 38, we started working in a combination of the two, whichever one had more restrictive requirements took precedent. A little bit how our program works, if we want to move on to the next slide. In terms of the resident or realtor experience, realtors are generally the ones that are requesting and scheduling the majority of our inspections. We have through our existing scheduling system, we allowed for realtors to request an evaluation. We guaranteed a 2 to 3 week turnaround time. Essentially, they booked an appointment, but gave them the option to select that if we had inspectors available, they allowed us to arrive unannounced as soon as possible. And that's the majority of what they selected to do. That allowed us to have some wiggle room in how we were actually conducting our inspections, grouping them by neighborhood to make sure that we were being as efficient as possible and, covering that large area that we have. We also had the opportunity if people had urgent requests, and there was a lot of hand holding as to what qualified as urgent. As you can all probably imagine, for a realtor, anything related to their property sale is considered urgent. Uh, and I would do a lot of follow-up asking questions about when their actual close date is. Are they even listed yet? To mitigate those requests. But if people did have legitimate need for an inspection within a shorter period of time, then I also had opportunity to sort of slip them in. And I found that no one really abused that opportunity. Following the inspection, as most of the time they didn't know what day I was coming, they just knew I was going to be there sometime in the next 2 to 3 weeks. They receive the automated email 24 to 48 hours following the inspection, which is set up through FireAside. Many of the realtors have accounts established within the FireAside system, and they're the ones that are accessing the reports rather than the homeowners. For many of them, they are able to resolve items for online review and approval, but for a lot of them, we do require a follow-up inspection, and for that, they then need to submit a new inspection request. Behind the scenes, we were working with maybe not as many resources as they thought we might have towards, for the fluidity of how the program was working with them. We had 50% of the time of one of our staff members dedicated to the program, both in terms of management, communications, administration, and the actual inspections. Then we had ad hoc time from additional staff members during peak demand who took on probably about a third of the inspections throughout the season. We were leveraging the existing scheduling system that we were using for other inspections, which didn't really align with the way we were conducting our real estate inspections, since generally for real estate, no one is meeting us there. And we, have the flexibility to fit it in between other appointments, whereas our existing scheduling system is for a date and time, and someone is expecting to meet the inspector for that. Our average inspection time for real estate transactions is about 20 minutes on site. And in comparison, for full access inspections for our general blanket inspections, the average inspection time is about 30 minutes. That's sort of the summary, sorry for the train in the background, of how our program works. And if you want to go on to the next slide, Jason, I'll talk.
I was gonna say, yeah, I've seen a couple people raise their hands. We're going to do question
Oh,
and
sure.
answers in about 10 minutes. I think we'll just so just so everyone knows, or if you put them in the chat, we'll try to respond to them. But in about 10 minutes, we'll do questions and answers. Sorry, Maria.
No worries. Sorry, I know I'm a fast talker and I'm an oversharer. So those two things combined mean that I'm just telling you guys a whole lot of information all at once. But Jason, feel free to jump in if you want to interrupt me with any, pertinent questions.
Okay, yeah. So if anyone has questions, put them in the chat, and I'll kind of MC that. Thank you.
Perfect. HOAs, we have a lot of HOAs in our district. Some of them are quite large, some of them are quite small. So it really runs the gamut in terms of who we're partnering with. But the leveraging the HOAs is a huge opportunity for us, and we're making progress with some of them. Um, Slowly, we also have one of our most important partners is highlighted in this case study. Tahoe Donner Homeowners Association is one of the, I think, the largest in the nation with 6,000 plus properties. They actually have their own forestry division, and they have their own blanket inspection program. They have the HOA divided into 6 inspection zones that they inspect to compliance on a 6-year cycle. So when our former fire chief was researching the opportunities for our inspection program or for our real estate inspection program, they first reached out to Tahoe Donner and asked what they thought. And they said, we're actually doing that already at time of sale because the HOA is, notified when a property is going to be sold. They were also conducting inspections at that time. Their Tahoe Donner's CCNRs, the code for the HOA actually exceeds 4291 and local defensible space ordinance requirements. So when we implemented Measure T in 2022, we brought them on board with FireAside and we let them continue doing what they were already doing very well, conducting their own inspections. So they're actually responsible for the real estate inspections in their HOA, and we share the data platform, we share tools for, interagency support. They do not presently require compliance at time of real estate sale, but they do conduct the inspection at time of sale. And then because of, again, the operations of the HOA being aware of any sale that happens within their HOA, they're able to do a cross check and identify if a property that was recently sold is in compliance or not. So if it's missed during the time of property sale, if it's inspected and disclosed the condition, but not yet brought into compliance, it will be caught in the subsequent inspection cycle whenever that property's zone comes into its inspection cycle year. So they have very high compliance results within Tahoe Donner. We're working with other HOAs that are self-inspecting for their general inspections, but we're still conducting real estate transaction inspections. And we're also working with many of them to improve the defensible space requirements within their CCNRs. Some of our HOAs, we have one that comes to mind that does require a compliant defensible space inspection prior to the close of escrow. And at first we had some overlapping challenges because they were conducting their own point of sale inspection and that conflicted with ours. So what they've adjusted to do is simply require that the seller provide Truckee Fire's compliant defensible space inspection. So in that case, we are still supporting the process, but it's the HOA, in fact, that's requiring that point of sale compliance. So lots of opportunities with the HOAs, and I can talk about more case studies and examples. But for now, if we move on to the next slide, Jason, I'll cover some of the stats on our inspection program. Uh, we are working on the same inspection criteria of compliance with PRC 4291 and our local ordinance as we do for our general educational inspections, but we're inspecting to a stricter interpretation or application of the code. So we're requiring heavier treatment to shrubs and plants, essentially, heavier spacing requirements and more strict tree removal in that we're looking at larger trees and more significant spacing to be achieved for a real estate inspection than we generally would with our educational inspections. And you can see that in the results. I'll sort of summarize down to the most telling stat here that non-structure discoveries per property in our periodic wildfire inspections, which are our educational inspections, we're identifying an average of 8 non-structure discoveries per property. So in FireAside, that's live vegetation, dead vegetation, and combustibles combined. In resale, we're identifying about 13. So we have a higher percentage of discoveries and a higher percentage of vegetation discoveries.
Maria,
This,
if I can just interrupt, because I think this is the question
please.
that came up was explaining, excuse me, when we talk discoveries or you talk about discoveries here, there's defensible space and home hardening. And one of the questions was, are you looking for home hardening items in addition to defensible space? You may just touch on that for a second.
Yes, thank you. Great question. And yes, we are. We're identifying all the same home hardening items on our real estate inspections as we do on our general inspections. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, we want our buyers to be aware of both the resilient and the vulnerable features of the property that they're taking. We want that they're taking on. We want every homeowner to be aware of those things because it influences not just decisions they make about their structure, but decisions that they make about their defensible space. We also find that homeowners and buyers in particular want that information for addressing their homeowners insurance. May have heard that we have a homeowners insurance crisis in California, and our buyers and homeowners are looking for whatever tools they can to help them gain insurance and keep insurance. So we're identifying both vulnerable and resilient features on properties, and we are doing that on both general inspections and on real estate inspections.
And
Great.
Maria, one other question is it may be worth just people are just asking like what the home makeup is of Truckee. Like, is it suburban homes? Is it large homes and like forest lots? So it may just be worth giving a little context on the housing stock that's inside of Truckee fire
Yeah,
protection.
yeah, 100%. We have a huge range. We have many neighborhoods that were uh, constructed sort of in en masse in homeowners associations or developments in the 70s, 80s. We also have large HOAs that are primarily new construction within the last 10 or 20 years. So we have a great mix of structures, both pre WUI building code and post WUI building code. We we consider our entire district WUI intermix. So we are essentially in forested areas. We're not really suburban. We are literally in the forest in many of our neighborhoods. So we don't have, generally we don't have large swaths of roadway, of commercial area, of pavement and concrete jungles that are surrounding our residential areas. Generally, our residential areas, many of them back right up to Forest Service property or state park property that is heavily forested. So great question there. And then in terms of lot size, we have areas that have 5+ acre parcels where there's, one or two structures on the parcel. And then we have areas that are uh, maybe quarter-acre parcels with dense uh, dense residential structures and still surrounded by trees. So it gets pretty dense in some areas, and we do take that into consideration in the larger picture of our inspections. However, we do try to educate and sort of, maintain the expectation that we talk about the two dials of home hardening and defensible space, that yes, a more hardened, resilient structure decreases or sort of gives you a little more leeway for your defensible space, but it doesn't buy anyone a pass for maintaining zone zero, for example. Does that answer most of those questions, Jason?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, great. Some more about our request and inspection volume for our program, mostly just to point out that um, turns out the busiest time for realtors looking for real estate inspections is right when we're super busy in April, May, June, when we are ramping up and launching our programs for the season. This has created a lot of challenges for us that we're still figuring out how to work through in terms of accommodating what our realtors need in terms of the turnaround time that they want, and uh, you know, maintaining the other obligations that our staff members have to other programs. Um, that's one of the things that I'll probably get into a little later on lessons learned and some of our goals, but we're also looking at how to use FireAside's resident request system and hopefully eventually use that more in the format of a scheduling system to replace the one that we're currently using in order for us to have more flexibility in our uh, implementation of the scheduling and less office work, essentially, in order to free up more of our time so that the time that we do have to dedicate to the real estate program is actually in the field conducting those inspections. And you'll see that if you add up the numbers, they don't actually match out. The number of requests, excuse me, requests that we receive for inspections is a good bit higher than the number of actual inspections that we conducted. And when I flesh that out, I would say that many of them are due to we're mitigating requests without actually having to go into the field, whether that is because there was already a recent full access inspection that was sufficient for disclosure purposes, or requests for reinspection where we were actually able to resolve via photo resolution. And then, user error where we're getting multiple requests received for the same inspection from different parties, or rescheduling requests, that sort of thing. That also just adds into the administrative time that is sucking up the time that we would rather be in the field conducting those inspections. So probably one of the more pertinent slides is our current results, and is the juice worth the squeeze? We are calculating, making a couple of assumptions about what the numbers are. We have approximately 900 real estate sales in 2024 within our district, and we're now including the Tahoe Donner numbers, and 671 properties that received a real estate inspection in 2024. We haven't actually done the cross-reference to see if those are the same properties that sold, but we're estimating that about 75% of the transactions in 2024 were inspected for real estate. And the majority of those presumably disclosed the real estate condition rather than bringing it into compliance, because only 36% of our properties that were inspected for real estate are now confirmed as compliant. So we have a couple of gaps. One of the gaps regarding real estate sale properties that were not inspected is likely due to the fact that we have snow on the ground in the winter. So depending on the season, we have a period of time when we're not conducting real estate transactions or real estate inspections, excuse me. And in that time period, realtors and the buyers and sellers revert to that workaround that I mentioned in AB 38, where the present condition, if known, is disclosed to the buyer, and the buyer takes responsibility for bringing the property into compliance. Um, let's see. We have more opportunity for data analysis within the chunk of data that we have here, but for the most part, we see that there's still a lot of opportunity, especially in conjunction with capabilities from FireAside in terms of automating some of the communications that we have. So I'll talk about that as well. Um, this winter, one of our uh, communication priorities was to engage more with the realtors. So I initiated a working group with those real estate professionals that scheduled the most inspections with me. And that was a good mix of transaction coordinators, realtors themselves, and sort of covering the different variations of people that we're interacting with, both within HOA communities and outside of HOA real estate groups. And there were a couple of things that they stressed were of the most importance to them in their professional capacity. Uh, they're not that upset about the requirement for defensible space disclosure. And I think, we sort of had a leg up here because the realtors have been accustomed to this requirement since 2019. But they accept it as a step in the sale process. They want it to look more like the other inspection types and the process for the other inspection types that they're accustomed to, however. And this was I think, a really great learning opportunity for us because we're only interacting with this very specific aspect of a real estate transaction. And for them, it stands out because it doesn't look like the other aspects of a real estate transaction. They said that speed matters. They want a much shorter turnaround time. They said that within a week of when they submit the request, they would like the inspection. That would be ideal, but a 1 to 2 week turnaround time, they could also work with. We have a lot of short escrow here. So sometimes the property goes on the market and within a day, they have someone that wants a 10-day escrow closure. I personally don't know why that's a thing, but that's why I'm not a realtor. So they would like that short turnaround time. And I asked them if they were comfortable sacrificing consistency in having a single person do the inspections. So consistency from one inspection to the next, or even consistency from the initial inspection to the follow-up inspection. If they were comfortable sacrificing consistency for a shorter turnaround time. And they said yes. We'll see how that fleshes out because when we first, started our communications with the realtors, what they asked for was consistency. So we'll see. It's the pendulum swing, that you can't make everybody happy all the time. But those were, interesting takeaways. The other thing they asked for was reporting that spoke specifically to the priorities of buyer seller at the time of real estate. They're not that interested in why each defensible space item is important for protecting the structure. They want to know how much it's going to cost, what the biggest priorities are, and they wanted it to be sorted by the biggest ticket items. They also had an interesting suggestion to me, which was that for the items that they found sort of nitpicky, namely pine needles on the roof, pine needles around the structure, that we do include the fire risk related to those because those are actually some of our highest fire risk items, and they just see them as frustrating. So they suggested that in those cases where it might not be obvious to people, that we provide the, evidence or at least some support to say why we're nitpicking on those specific things. The last thing that they asked for was additional support and training around communicating with their clients. I was throughout the season on the phone with realtors, with contractors, with buyers and sellers, explaining, the same things over and over. It behooves me and them to put it into writing and put it on a website so that they can provide those answers as easily as I can. They also asked for more training on how to read our report. There's a ton of information, and they want to be able to, flip to the most important page and show their clients the most important aspects of the report. So those are all things that we've, gained an understanding, and we're sort of brainstorming and troubleshooting how to address those. In the bigger picture of what we have learned, and are hoping to implement in terms of the real estate program as a whole, the first one is that early engagement is key. And this ties in with the second point as well. The real estate agents, we need to think of them and treat them as our allies in this process rather than adversaries. You know, if we talk to them like it's something we're imposing upon them, then they're going to feel like that, and they're going to talk to their clients that way as well. If we talk to them in that we are supporting them in complying with their real estate disclosure requirements, if we're supporting them in making full disclosure to a buyer of potential costs associated with the property, then they are able to see it, understand it in a way that serves their professional, interests and obligations, as well as the fact that they're also residents here. If we talk to them in a way where we're saying, disclosing defensible space condition and also setting a high standard for compliance for people buying in the area that might not live here full time, we're telling them what it looks like for them to be a responsible home and landowner in our neighborhood. These are their neighborhoods as well. And through, that sort of thinking, we can engage with them better. Providing clarity and process builds trust. So I'm an over communicator. I send them lots of messages about when they can expect stuff from me and when they can expect the season to open or close. And when you can't provide clarity of process, then communicate. It builds rapport. I have plenty of agents who, sometimes my answer to them is, I don't know, or I can't help you, but they're comfortable accepting that from me because they know that I want to help them and that I'm available to them when they need me. So our program goals for our real estate program is we obviously want to increase the number of resale properties getting an initial inspection. We want to increase our conversion rate to full compliance. We want to engage with our recent buyers, and we also want to improve our efficiency. We want to, increase the number of inspections we're doing and the compliance conversion while lowering the burden of office work related to these real estate transactions. So lots of big goals, and we have some ideas on how to meet them. We're going to continue our outreach and education to the real estate community. We're going to push to engage our title companies to ensure that they're aware of and clear on what enforcement, what requirements they are sort of the gatekeepers for. We're going to encourage compliance prior to inspection, and hopefully, increase our sort of automation in terms of follow-up communications and reminders for the non-compliant homes. We also want to take advantage of FireAside's ability to sort of automate welcome to the neighborhood letters, which it's welcome to the neighborhood. Your property isn't compliant yet. So schedule an inspection with us. And we also want to improve our scheduling systems and reporting and querying processes in order to make the whole follow-up process easier. With
Well,
that,
and
I
so
think I pass it back to you. Thanks so
thank you,
much,
Maria.
Jason.
No, thank you for that. And then, so last slide, and then we'll kind of jump into questions and answers. Either put them in the chat or kind of raise your hand. And so, just kind of building off of what Maria said. Certainly, from our perspective, always looking for ways to help our communities meet those goals. And so, some of the things that we're continuing to develop in partnership with Truckee and other places is how to think about different engagement campaigns. How do you send out some of those reminders so that Maria doesn't have to track how many days it is from the sale and their compliance status? All of that can be automated, triggering in those welcome packages as the public record information updates or that we know there's a transaction. So, as Maria said, welcome to the neighborhood, and perhaps it's your home is not compliant, or welcome to the neighborhood and your home is compliant, but this is what you need to do to maintain that. Just different ways that we can help engage residents and build off of the fact that we got home compliant at the time of transaction. And then on the second side, we're also looking a lot at like workflow improvements around there. So how do we really help track all these different properties? And while we've talked today a lot about just the simple transaction, there's times where homes will transact two or three times, or too much, two times inside of a year. Somebody buys it and then it transacts again. And so how do you start to like reset the clock and think about there's now been, three legal owners inside of 12 months and some of those kinds of things, as well as just thinking about some of the dispatch tools to help with scheduling resources, and then where there's the opportunity to collect a fee or something like that, implementing some of the paywall. So all of those are things that are either in progress, already exist today, in progress, or continuing to roll out as you're thinking about how to improve your real estate program as well. And so with that, we'll send this around to anyone who would like it. There's some resources that Maria had pulled together, sharing kind of the dedicated website that Truckee Fire has for the real estate, some information about Tahoe Donner, as well as some general resources. So again, we'll circulate this after the webinar. And with that, questions for probably I'll answer what I can, but I'll turn it over to Maria. So it looks like there was a question, just I don't know if you can see them, Maria, but the first one was, it was sort of, can you characterize the quantity and quality of work that's being required?
Yeah, great question. Um, Quality, yeah, okay. Quantity and quality. So as I said, on average, I think we were finding 13 defensible space findings on the real estate inspections, and that could very well constitute, multiple items captured under one particular discovery. So in some cases, we're talking about tree removal. We generally are not requiring removal of trees larger than, um, let's say, 10 to 12 inches DBH, and a lot of shrub vegetation removal. Oftentimes it's changes to established landscaping, which is where we get a lot of pushback. People with, you know, juniper and very expensive, very small, but, old trees. I don't understand them again, uh, that are right up under their eaves. So it can be quite a range, but a lot of it is stuff that is above and beyond the capacity of an individual homeowner to do. We do have properties where, we have a lot of handy folks up here that own their own chainsaw. On the larger properties, some of them own their own masticator. So it is in many cases extensive work, and I'm happy to share, if we do an export, Jason, on number of the particular findings per real estate transaction, I'm happy to share that.
That's a good idea. Okay. Um, there was another question that was about the fee for one of these inspections, and I think Maria, you guys don't charge today, correct? If you want to maybe.
That's correct. Yeah. So thanks for asking that. When I spoke to former fire chief that introduced O1 2019, he said that he wishes that the fee was something that they had stuck to their guns on and implementing. And they had originally proposed a $150 fee. We don't presently uh, require a fee for service, but we are in talks about implementing that in order for us to fund a full-time staff member to be dedicated to the real estate program. And we would take into account, the amount of time per inspection and then also the amount of time on the admin side. And I think we are looking at between $150 and $200, which is in the same range as what you pay for other types of inspections in relation to home sales. When we floated that idea, mentioned it to our realtors on last year's webinar, we didn't really get much pushback or questions. I think that we'll probably get some pushback just on principle, but once it's implemented and rolled out, I don't think that there's going to be much of a challenge. We do feel that we'll need to significantly improve our turnaround time once we start charging fee for service, to within a week, ideally, turnaround time.
Thanks, May. Another question asking about home hardening mitigations and whether or not any home hardening is required under at time of real estate. And then there's some examples of that. But just how does home hardening kind of fit into the real estate transaction?
Yep, another great question. Our report is clearly divided defensible space violations and home hardening recommendations, and that's stressed as well. The recommendations are suggestions for improving home hardening, and it is possible, however, that an insurance company might require certain things to be done in order for the home to be insured. We've seen that a lot, not just in conjunction with real estate, but for homeowners insurance to be renewed. Things like enclosing under a deck, creating 5 feet non-combustible.
Great. Let's see how the question here. So the question is, so the inspection just identifies the issue before the property is sold, but they're not required to complete the changes before the sale. And then apologize if they didn't understand that. Just maybe that sequence to reiterate how that works.
100%. Yes. The stated intersection of our O1 2019 and AB 38 is that they are required to have the property inspected and disclose that inspection that took place within 6 months of the real estate transaction. Our code and the state code does not require that the property be brought into compliance because it allows that workaround. The way that the AB 38 is written, the workaround is the exception. If the property cannot be brought into compliance, then the buyer is allowed to take responsibility. Some HOAs do require that compliance, though, as they're allowed to require that above and beyond.
And certainly certainly some of the things I think we've seen at FireAside is then where the responsibility transfers to the buyer, so it's disclosed and it transfers to the buyer, then the burden, of course, a little bit becomes honestly on the fire departments or the fire districts to track it, make sure the buyer knows about it, all the follow-up work, which is where some of that admin overhead comes into place. So, collectively thinking about how do we make it really easy for the fire departments to track those things because a buyer assumes the responsibility, but if there's no follow-up or tracking of that, then it just sort of falls by the wayside. So.
Correct.
All right, we've got a few minutes left. Any last questions from the audience? Otherwise, we'll thank Maria for sharing her insights. As I said, we'll for those who want it, we'll share out the slides, and certainly if you have questions, you can ask me. I won't. Maria's given enough her time, but if there's any key questions, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer them afterwards. So, any last questions from the audience? There was at least one thank you in there for Maria thank you very much for sharing your time from the audience. So.
Of course. I'm happy to have my contact information shared, Jason, if people have follow-up questions or want additional stats or resources from us.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you again, Maria. Thanks for all the hard work you do up there and getting Truckee resilient. And thanks for everyone for joining us today.
Great. Thanks so
All right.
much, Jason. Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Bye bye.